My husband at that time had gotten letters of introduction from the head of a theater chain. Those were the days when theater chains were very important, and they extended courtesies of this sort.
She served her country in wartime, earned a master's degree, interviewed one of Hollywood's biggest stars as a journalist, and then accidentally became one of the most recognized faces on American television, all before being publicly stabbed in the back by the man she considered family. But the part of Nancy Kulp's story that nobody talked about for decades wasn't the betrayal, and it wasn't the fame. It was what she finally said out loud in a private interview years before she died. A confession so carefully guarded that the world wasn't allowed to hear it until she was already gone. The confession they held back until she was gone. In 1989, Nancy Kulp sat down for a recorded interview with author Bose Hadley, who was working on a book about Hollywood's hidden history. Before a single word was spoken, both parties signed a legal agreement. The contents of that interview were not to be released to the public until after Nancy had passed away. She died in February of 1991. The book came out in 1994. What readers found inside was the kind of candor that Hollywood had spent decades making impossible. Nancy confirmed in her own words that she was a gay woman, and had been her entire life. She didn't announce it with anger. She framed it the way a person does when they have been carrying something heavy for a very long time and have finally decided they are too tired to keep holding it alone. She described it through metaphor, the way people of her generation often did when the direct language still felt dangerous. But the meaning was unmistakable. For her fans, many of whom had grown up watching her play the lovable, perpetually overlooked Jane Hathaway on the Beverly Hillbillies, this was a revelation. Not because it changed who she was, but because it explained so much about the life she had lived, the marriage that didn't quite add up, the roles she accepted without complaint, and the particular kind of loneliness that followed her through the height of her fame. The confession didn't surface as gossip or as a scandal. It arrived quietly through a book, years after she was gone. And that quiet is what made it land so hard. Before Hollywood, there was a war to fight. To understand what Nancy Kulp was walking away from when she finally told her truth, you have to understand what she had already been through before she ever set foot on a film set. She was born on August 28, 1921, in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Her father was a traveling salesman, and her mother taught at a public school. The family didn't stay in one place for long. Economic pressure during the Great Depression pushed them from town to town across Pennsylvania before they eventually resettled in Florida in the mid-1930s, chasing steadier ground. Nancy was sharp from early on. She enrolled at Florida State College for Women, and then kept going, earning a master's degree in English and French from the University of Miami. She was a member of an academic sorority and had a clear appetite for ideas. When she graduated, she went straight into journalism. By the early 1940s, she was working as a feature writer for the Miami Beach Tropic, covering cultural stories and profiling public figures. One of her most talked-about pieces came from an interview she managed to secure with Clark Gable, at the time one of the most famous men in America, while he was in the middle of military training. It was the kind of access that required confidence, persistence, and serious professional credibility. Nancy had all three. Then the war changed everything. In 1944, with World War II grinding toward its most intense phase, Nancy made a decision that surprised people who knew her. She paused her journalism career and enlisted in the United States Navy Reserve, joining WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. She wasn't a passive recruit. She trained in cryptography and military logistics, climbed the ranks, and was eventually commissioned as a lieutenant. She handled classified intelligence work for the duration of her service. When the war ended in 1946, she was discharged with a clean record and 2 medals, the American Campaign Medal and the National Defense Service Medal. She was 24 years old, a decorated veteran, a published journalist, and a master's degree holder. And nobody in Hollywood would ever really talk about any of that. The director who changed her life with one sentence. Nancy didn't move to Hollywood to act. That part matters. She arrived in 1951 with a background in communications and got hired at 20th Century Fox as a public relations specialist. She was good at it. She understood media, she understood people, and she knew how to frame a story. It was a natural extension of her journalism career, just pointed in a different direction. But one afternoon, veteran director George Cukor passed through her part of the studio and stopped. Cukor had a reputation for spotting things other people missed, particularly in the faces and demeanors of people who weren't performing. He looked at Nancy, took in her bone structure, her low and distinctive voice, the way she carried herself, and told her directly that she was wasting her time behind the scenes. Her place was in front of a camera. That single conversation rerouted her life. Within the same year, she had her first film role in The Model and The Marriage Broker. From there, she moved quickly. In 1953, she appeared in Shane, playing Mrs. Emma Wright to solid reviews. By 1954, she was appearing in films that were competing for Academy Awards, including Sabrina, where she shared the screen with Audrey Hepburn, and A Star is Born. Within 3 years of being discovered in a PR office, she was working alongside the biggest names in the industry. But something else happened in 1951 that would shape the next decade of her life in a far more private way. On April 1st of that year, Nancy married a man named Charles Malcolm Duus in Dade County, Florida. On the surface, it looked like a straightforward event, an actress, newly arrived in Hollywood, getting married. But researchers who later examined public records noticed the timing didn't add up. The legal divorce was recorded in 1953, but personal tax documents showed the two maintained a financial and legal connection until as late as 1961. This kind of arrangement had a name in Hollywood at the time. It was called a lavender marriage, a union entered into by gay men or women to present a socially acceptable front to the public and to the studios. The practice was widespread during the McCarthy era, when the entertainment industry was under intense scrutiny, and any deviation from conventional norms could end a career overnight. Studios expected it. Some actively encouraged it. For Nancy Kulp, it bought her nearly a decade of professional safety and a private life she had to keep entirely hidden. 9 years of fame built on a joke at her expense. In 1962, CBS launched The Beverly Hillbillies, and Nancy Kulp was cast as Jane Hathaway, the prim, bespectacled, fiercely competent secretary to the bumbling banker Milburn Drysdale. The show became a cultural phenomenon almost immediately. Within its first season, it was pulling in tens of millions of viewers and sitting at the top of the national ratings. At its peak, it was one of the most watched programs in the history of American television. Nancy's performance was sharp, consistent, and frequently the most grounded thing on screen. In 1967, she received an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Supporting Actress. By any professional measure, she had arrived. But the way the show used her character is harder to look back on. The Beverly Hillbillies repeatedly structured its comedy around Jane Hathaway being physically unattractive and romantically unwanted. Her unrequited interest in Jethro Bodine, played by Max Baer Jr., was a running gag, set up specifically so audiences could laugh at the idea of a woman like her hoping for love. The writers returned to this well constantly, and the media outside the show was even less kind. Several entertainment publications at the time openly called her the ugliest woman on television. Nancy absorbed all of it publicly and said very little. But privately, she wrote in her diary about what it felt like to have her entire identity reduced to a punchline. She noted that the show's writers seemed to have decided, from the start, that Jane Hathaway was only funny if she was miserable. Nobody in the audience or the writer's room was supposed to root for her to find happiness. That was the whole setup. What made it worse was the gap between who Nancy actually was and who the audience thought they were seeing. She was a military veteran, a trained journalist, a multilingual scholar. The character she was playing was a caricature of intellectual spinsterdom. and the show made sure viewers never forgot it. When CBS canceled the Beverly Hillbillies in 1971, the aftermath was brutal for Nancy in ways it wasn't for her co-stars. The network had shifted its programming strategy away from rural comedies, but the industry-wide effect on her specifically was severe. Directors across Hollywood refused to consider her for dramatic roles. The reasoning, stated plainly in some cases, was that her face had been too deeply associated with comedic eccentricity to be believable in anything else. It was typecasting used as a permanent door. She was locked out, and the key had been thrown away by the very success that was supposed to define her. The woman who ran for Congress, and what it cost her. Facing a Hollywood that had closed its doors, Nancy Kulp didn't retreat. She redirected. She had spent years quietly involved in Democratic Party work in Pennsylvania, serving as a consultant and showing up where she was needed without seeking attention for it. By the early 1980s, she had built enough of a local foundation that a congressional run felt like a real possibility. In 1984, she made it official, announcing her candidacy for the United States House of Representatives in Pennsylvania's 9th Congressional District as a Democrat. The district was a tough draw. It covered a large, mostly rural stretch of central Pennsylvania with a voter base rooted in agriculture, coal mining, and deeply conservative values. Her opponent was Bud Shuster, a Republican incumbent who had held the seat for 12 consecutive years, had a massive funding operation, and knew every corner of the district. And layered on top of all of that, 1984 was a presidential election year. Ronald Reagan was on the ballot, and his popularity was generating a conservative wave that was sweeping candidates into office across the country. Nancy ran anyway, and she ran hard. She bought a motorhome and drove herself through dozens of small towns, stopping at community halls, diners, and front porches to talk to voters directly. She leaned on her name recognition from the Beverly Hillbillies, not as a celebrity stunt, but as a way to get in the door with people who might otherwise wave her off. Once she had their attention, she made her case on substance. The sincerity of a woman with her background, Navy veteran, journalist, academic, started moving numbers. Schuster's campaign noticed, and then Buddy Ebsen made a phone call. Ebsen had played Jed Clampett on The Beverly Hillbillies, the patriarch of the family, Nancy's on-screen boss, and the man the audience trusted most. Off-screen, they had worked alongside each other for 9 years. By 1984, he was one of the most recognizable faces in American television, and he was also a committed conservative with close personal ties to the Reagan administration. Schuster's campaign recruited him. Ebsen recorded a 60-second radio advertisement that ran on stations across the district in the final stretch of the race. In it, he told voters that Nancy was too liberal, too progressive, and simply not equipped to represent them in Congress. He said he liked her personally, and then used that framing to make the attack land harder. Coming from someone who had shared a set with her for nearly a decade, someone the voters associated with trustworthiness and folksiness, the message hit exactly where it was designed to. The campaign replayed it constantly, and it worked. On Election Day in November of 1984, Bud Shuster won re-election with more than 65% of the vote. Nancy's congressional dream was over. In the days after the loss, she spoke to reporters about what Ebsen had done. She didn't soften it. She called it a betrayal, cruel, deliberate, and something she had not seen coming from someone she considered part of her family. Their relationship, which had survived 9 years on a television set and everything that came with it, did not survive the radio ad. What she carried that nobody could see. The political defeat broke something in Nancy that the Hollywood typecasting hadn't quite reached. Getting shut out of roles was professional. What Ebsen did was personal, and it happened in public. In front of the voters she had spent months trying to win over. She stepped back from public life after 1984. She took a position teaching art at a university level, contributed to charitable work, and largely stayed out of the spotlight. But the years between the campaign loss and her death were not empty ones. They were the years in which she finally made peace with the parts of herself she had been managing in secret for her entire adult life. The interview with Bose Hadley in 1989 was part of that. So was the decision to place a legal hold on it until after she was gone. She wasn't trying to make a statement from beyond the grave. She was trying to tell the truth without having to live through the consequences in real time, which, for a woman of her generation, was a completely reasonable calculation. Her years in Hollywood had shown her exactly what happened to people who stepped outside what the industry expected of them. The lavender marriage, the careful silences, the roles she accepted without complaint. All of it had been a form of self-protection that cost her enormously and quietly over decades. The confession wasn't a dramatic act. It was the last honest thing she could do on her own terms. In 1990, she was diagnosed with malignant lymphoma. She moved to Palm Desert, California, to receive treatment and to step away from everything that wasn't essential. The chemotherapy was brutal. Her condition worsened steadily through the year. When word reached Buddy Ebsen that Nancy was dying, something shifted in him. He was older by then, and the distance between 1984 and 1990 had apparently given him enough time to understand what he had done. He wrote her a letter, handwritten, sent directly to her, in which he expressed regret for the role he had played in ending her political campaign. It was a private apology, not a public one. There was no press release. He wasn't looking for credit. Nancy received the letter and responded through a close associate. She was ready to let it go. She had reached the point where carrying the resentment was simply not worth the energy it required. She chose to forgive him, not because what he did was acceptable, but because she had more important things to spend her final months on. She died on February 3, 1991, at the home of a close friend in Palm Springs, California. She was 69 years old. Her body was returned to Pennsylvania and buried at Westminster Presbyterian Cemetery in Mifflintown, the small town where her family had once stopped during their Depression-era travels and where she had first become the person she would spend the rest of her being. What she actually left behind. The obituaries in 1991 focused mostly on the Beverly Hillbillies. That was the version of Nancy Kulp the public knew, and that was the version they mourned. Very few of the tributes mentioned the Navy service, the journalism career, the congressional run, or the interview sitting in a publisher's archive waiting to be released. When Hollywood Lesbians came out in 1994, it found a specific readership, people interested in the hidden history of the entertainment industry, scholars of LGBTQ history, fans who had always sensed there was more to Nancy than the show ever let her express. For that audience, the book was significant, but it didn't reach the mainstream the way her story deserved to. What has changed in the decades since is the lens through which people now look at Jane Hathaway. The character that 1960s audiences were supposed to laugh at. The angular, brilliant, romantically invisible woman who kept everything running while being treated as a joke reads very differently now. Cultural critics and TV historians have written about Jane Hathaway as an unintentional portrait of a woman who was never allowed to be fully seen. A character whose quiet competence existed entirely in the service of people who didn't value it. The comedy hasn't aged well, but the performance underneath the comedy has. Nancy Kulp was playing someone who had learned to make herself useful and unobtrusive in a world that wasn't designed for her. And she was doing it with the kind of precision that only comes from genuinely understanding what that feels like. The massive co-star who tried to bury her political career went on to live another 2 decades. Buddy Ebsen died in 2003 at the age of 95. By the end of his life, he had spoken publicly about his regret over the 1984 radio ad, though the details of his private letter to Nancy remained largely out of the press. Nancy got no such second chapter. She had one shot at public life on her own terms, the congressional campaign, and it was taken from her by someone she trusted. The confession she recorded in 1989 was her version of a second chapter, written quietly, released posthumously, on a timeline she controlled. For a woman who spent most of her career having very little control over how the world saw her, That might have been the most powerful thing she ever did. If Nancy Kulp had made that confession while she was still alive, knowing what Hollywood would have done with it, do you think the world would have been ready to hear her? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.